I watched through my kitchen window as Patricia Westfield pulled into my driveway for the third time that week, her white Lexus SUV gleaming in the Arizona sun like a beacon of impending doom. She had that look on her face, the one that meant she'd found something new to complain about, and my stomach dropped because I knew whatever it was would somehow become my problem. I lived in Desert Springs, a planned community just outside of Scottsdale, Arizona, where the HOA had more rules than the actual state legislature. My name is Zachary Everson, and I'd moved into this neighborhood 6 months ago thinking I'd finally found my slice of peace after a messy divorce. The house was perfect, the neighbors seemed friendly enough, and the desert landscape reminded me why I loved living in the Southwest. What I hadn't counted on was Patricia, the HOA president, who treated the neighborhood covenants like they were the 10 Commandments carved in stone. She knocked on my door with that distinctive 3-rap pattern that somehow conveyed authority and impatience simultaneously. I set down my coffee and opened the door, trying to maintain a pleasant expression. "Good morning, Patricia. What can I help you with today?" Her perfectly manicured hand clutched a leather-bound folder against her chest. She was 52, impeccably dressed in a coral blouse and white caprice, with blonde highlights that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Zachary, we need to discuss a serious violation of the HOA covenants. May I come in?" I stepped aside, knowing that refusing would only make this worse. Patricia swept into my living room like she owned the place, which in a way she probably thought she did. "I've noticed," she began, settling onto my couch without being invited, "that you have a rather large propane tank on the side of your property. According to Section 17, subsection C of our community guidelines, all utility installations must be approved by the architectural committee before installation." I blinked, genuinely confused. "Patricia, that tank was here when I bought the house. The previous owner had it installed because this whole street runs on propane. We're not connected to natural gas lines out here." She waved her hand dismissively. "That may be, but I have no record of its approval. Furthermore, I've been reviewing our community's utility usage, and I believe we could benefit from a centralized propane system. It would be more efficient and aesthetically pleasing." "A centralized system?" I asked, trying to understand where this was going. "Yes. I'm proposing that all homeowners connect to a main tank that would be managed by the HOA. It would simplify billing and maintenance. And frankly, Zachary, your tank is an eyesore. It needs to be hidden behind proper screening." The tank in question was a standard 500-gallon propane tank, painted beige to blend with the desert surroundings. It sat on a concrete pad about 15 feet from my house, clearly visible from the street, but hardly what I'd call an eyesore. It powered my heating, water heater, cooking range, and the outdoor grill I'd just installed. "I'm not really interested in switching to a centralized system," I said carefully. "This tank works fine, and I have a good relationship with my propane supplier. They give me competitive rates and reliable service." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't a request, Zachary. The HOA board is voting on this initiative next week, and we expect all residents to comply. In the meantime, I need you to provide documentation proving that tank was properly approved. And if I can't, it was installed over 10 years ago. Then it will need to be removed or brought into compliance with current standards. I'll need access to inspect it and verify its capacity for our records." Something about the way she said that last part made my skin crawl. "Access? You want access to my propane tank? The HOA needs to maintain accurate records of all utility installations within the community." I'll need the access panel code and a key to the gate surrounding it. I didn't have a gate surrounding it. Neither did anyone else in the neighborhood. Patricia, I think you're confusing my property with someone else's. There's no gate. Then there should be. That's another violation. All propane tanks must be secured behind appropriate fencing. I'll be sending you a formal notice of violation by end of business today. She stood up, smoothing her caprice with an air of finality. I trust you'll take care of this promptly. The fines for non-compliance start at $50 per day. After she left, I stood in my living room feeling like I'd just been hit by a tornado made of bureaucracy and entitlement. I called my neighbor, Marcus Chen, who'd lived in Desert Springs for 15 years. "Oh man, she got to you about the propane thing," Marcus laughed, though it wasn't a happy sound. "She's been on this kick for about a month now. Started with the Hendersons, then moved to the Pratts. Everyone's getting the same speech. But why? What does she care about our propane tanks?" "No idea, but I'd watch out. Patricia doesn't do anything without a reason, and that reason usually involves making money somehow." I thanked Marcus and hung up, then did what any reasonable person would do in 2025. I started Googling. It turned out that HOA-managed utility systems were a real thing, though not particularly common. The HOA would essentially become a middleman between the homeowners and the utility company, and while it could theoretically create economies of scale, it also created opportunities for markup and fees. The formal violation notice arrived in my email at 4:47 p.m. that afternoon. It was professionally formatted, complete with photos of my property that Patricia must have taken while walking past. The alleged violations included unauthorized utility installation, failure to properly screen utility equipment, and inadequate security measures for hazardous materials. The last one made me laugh out loud. Propane tanks were completely standard in this part of Arizona. I decided to fight back the only way I knew how, with documentation. I called the title company that had handled my home purchase and requested all previous records related to the property. Then I contacted my propane supplier, Desert Gas Solutions, and asked them about the history of my tank installation. The woman on the phone, whose name was Rita, sounded sympathetic. "Oh, you're in Desert Springs. Yeah, we've been getting some weird calls from your HOA president lately. She's been asking about our contracts and pricing structures. Wanted to know how much we charge per gallon and whether we'd be willing to work with her on a bulk pricing agreement." "Really? When was this?" "Started about 6 weeks ago. She called 3 times, actually. The last time, she asked specifically about your address and whether we'd be willing to terminate service if the HOA requested it." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What did you tell her?" "That we have a contract with you, not the HOA, and we're not in the business of terminating service to paying customers." She didn't like that answer much. Got pretty snippy, actually. I thanked Rita and made a note to document everything. Something wasn't adding up and I wanted to be prepared. The following Tuesday, I attended the HOA board meeting at the community center. About 20 homeowners showed up, which was apparently a high turnout. Patricia sat at the head table with 4 other board members: Donald Martinez, the vice president; Susan Kowalski, the treasurer; Jennifer Hughes, the secretary; and Tom Bradford, a member at large. Patricia called the meeting to order and quickly moved through the standard agenda items: approval of last month's minutes, financial report, landscape committee updates. Then she got to new business. "I'm proposing that Desert Springs transition to a centralized propane management system," she announced, pulling up a PowerPoint presentation on the screen behind her. "As many of you know, approximately 60% of our homes rely on propane for heating and cooking. Currently, each homeowner manages their own contracts with various suppliers, leading to inconsistent pricing and service quality. I propose we consolidate these contracts under HOA management. A man in the back raised his hand. How would that work exactly? The HOA would contract with a single supplier for bulk propane delivery. Each home would be metered, and costs would be billed monthly through HOA dues. The initial investment would include installing a central storage facility and running lines to participating homes. How much would that cost? Someone else asked. Patricia clicked to the next slide. Initial estimates suggest approximately $8,000 per household for connection and installation. However, the long-term savings would more than offset this cost. The room erupted in protests. $8,000 was a significant expense, especially for something we didn't need. I raised my hand. Patricia, has this been approved by the membership? According to our bylaws, any special assessment over $500 requires a vote. Her expression tightened. This isn't a special assessment, Zachary. It's a voluntary upgrade program. Those who wish to participate would benefit from reduced rates and simplified billing. But you just sent me a violation notice saying my existing tank needs to be removed or brought into compliance. That doesn't sound very voluntary. Your tank is non-compliant with current architectural standards. That's a separate issue. Donald Martinez leaned forward, looking uncomfortable. Patricia, maybe we should table this discussion until we've had more time to research the costs and benefits. This seems like a major undertaking. I've done the research, Donald. I have quotes from contractors and preliminary agreements with suppliers. All we need is board approval to move forward with the voluntary program. Susan Kowalski, the treasurer, frowned at her notes. I'm looking at our budget, and I don't see any allocation for the infrastructure needed to support this. Even if it's voluntary, the HOA would need to invest in the central facility and management system. We're talking about a significant financial commitment. Patricia's jaw clenched. The costs would be covered by connection fees and monthly management charges. It's revenue neutral at worst, and potentially profitable for the association. That word, profitable, hung in the air like a bad smell. HOAs weren't supposed to be profit centers. They existed to maintain common areas and enforce reasonable standards, not to run utility companies. The meeting dragged on for another hour, with Patricia growing increasingly defensive as homeowners raised objections. Finally, Tom Bradford made a motion to table the proposal pending a detailed financial analysis and legal review. The motion passed 4-1, with only Patricia voting against it. As we filed out of the community center, Patricia caught up with me in the parking lot. This isn't over, Zachary. Your tank is still in violation, and I expect you to address that immediately. I'm working on getting the historical documentation, I replied, and I've contacted an attorney to review the HOA's authority regarding utility installations. That was a bluff. I hadn't contacted an attorney yet, but I was seriously considering it. Her eyes narrowed. Don't threaten me. I have every right to enforce our covenants, and I have every right to ensure those covenants are being applied fairly and legally. Have a good evening, Patricia. I drove home feeling both triumphant and anxious. I'd stood up to her, but I knew this was far from resolved. The next morning, I woke up to find a chain and padlock wrapped around my propane tank. A laminated notice hung from the lock. Property secured pending compliance inspection. Contact HOA office for access. Per Desert Springs CC and Articus Section 17, C. I stood there in my backyard, coffee cup in hand, staring at this absurdity in disbelief. She had actually come onto my property and locked up my propane tank. I immediately called Desert Gas Solutions. Rita answered on the second ring. "Rita, it's Zachary Everson again. I need an emergency service call. Someone's locked up my propane tank." "What? Who would do that?" "My HOA president. Can you send someone out today? I need this lock removed." "Sir, if there's a lock on the tank, our technicians can't service it. That's a safety and liability issue. You'll need to remove the lock first." "But I don't have a key. I didn't put it there." Rita was quiet for a moment. "This is a weird suggestion, but you might want to call the police. If someone's restricting your access to your own utility service without authorization, that could be theft or vandalism." I thanked her and hung up, then dialed the Scottsdale Police Department's non-emergency line. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who sounded skeptical but agreed to send an officer out. Officer James Rodriguez arrived about 45 minutes later. He was in his early 30s, professional but clearly trying to figure out if this was really a police matter. "So let me get this straight," he said, examining the lock. "Your HOA president came onto your property and locked up your propane tank. That's what happened. I went to bed last night, everything was fine. Woke up this morning to find this. Do you have security cameras?" I didn't, which I was now regretting. "No, but she's the only person who's been demanding access to my tank. She sent me a violation notice 3 days ago saying the tank was non-compliant." Officer Rodriguez took photos of the lock and the notice. "Here's the thing. HOAs have certain rights when it comes to accessing properties for inspections and maintenance. But utility access is a gray area. You're saying this is preventing you from using your propane. I can't get service or maintenance done with that lock on there. My supplier won't touch it. And you're the property owner. This is your tank." "Yes, it came with the house when I bought it 6 months ago." He made notes on his phone. "I'm going to document this and contact your HOA. Technically, if they're restricting your access to utilities, that could be considered harassment or illegal interference with service. But HOA disputes usually need to be resolved through civil channels. You might need to contact an attorney." After he left, I did exactly that. I found Rebecca Klein, a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in Phoenix, about a 30-minute drive from Desert Springs. I managed to get an appointment for that afternoon. Rebecca was in her late 40s, with curly red hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that I immediately appreciated. I showed her photos of the locked tank, the violation notices, and explained Patricia's push for the centralized propane system. "This is interesting," Rebecca said, leaning back in her chair. "HOAs have broad authority, but they can't interfere with utility services. That's considered an essential service, and blocking access could violate state laws. Arizona revised statutes have specific provisions about utility access. So what can I do? First, I'm going to send a cease and desist letter to your HOA demanding immediate removal of that lock. Second, I want to review your CC and Articus to see what they actually say about utility installations. Third, we need to figure out what Patricia's real angle is here, because this feels personal. She wants to set up a centralized propane system and charge homeowners for connection and monthly management fees." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "That's a significant financial undertaking." "Has she disclosed whether she has any financial interest in the propane company or contractors involved?" I hadn't thought of that. "No, she hasn't. That would be a conflict of interest and potentially grounds for removal from the board. Let me do some digging." I paid Rebecca a retainer fee and left her office feeling like I'd finally done something proactive. But I still had a locked propane tank and no way to access my fuel. When I got home, there was a note taped to my front door. Mr. Everson, as per HOA regulations, access to non-compliant utility installations will be restricted until proper documentation and safety inspections are completed. Please contact the HOA office to schedule your compliance inspection. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in forced removal of the installation at owner's expense. Patricia Westfield, HOA President. I called Rebecca immediately and read her the note. She let out a long breath. Okay, this just became more serious. She's threatening to remove your propane tank, which would leave you without heating and cooking fuel. That's absolutely not legal. I'm filing for an emergency restraining order first thing tomorrow morning. That evening, I sat in my living room with my laptop, researching everything I could find about Patricia Westfield. It turned out she'd been HOA president for 6 years, running unopposed in every election. She owned her home outright and had no mortgage. Her husband, Richard, was a real estate developer who specialized in planned communities. That connection made me pause. Real estate developer, planned communities, utility systems. I started searching for Richard Westfield's business ventures and found his company, Westfield Development Group. Their portfolio included several residential communities across Arizona, Nevada, and California. I clicked through their case studies and found something interesting. Several of their developments featured integrated utility management systems that provided electricity, water, and gas through centralized facilities managed by the HOA. I dug deeper and found articles about these systems. While they were marketed as convenient and cost-effective, several had faced lawsuits from homeowners claiming they were being overcharged. In one case in Henderson, Nevada, residents discovered the HOA was marking up utility costs by 30% and pocketing the difference. My phone rang. It was Marcus from next door. "Hey, Zachary, I just saw Patricia leaving your property again. She was taking pictures of your house and the propane tank with some guy in a suit." "When was this?" "About 10 minutes ago. Thought you should know." I thanked him and immediately checked my doorbell camera footage, which I just installed that afternoon after Officer Rodriguez's visit. Sure enough, there was Patricia with a middle-aged man in a dark suit, pointing at my propane tank and gesturing animatedly. The video had audio. "This is one of the larger installations," Patricia was saying. 500 gallons. If we can force compliance on this one, the others will fall in line." "And you're confident the HOA has the authority?" the man asked. "Absolutely. The CC and Articus give us broad discretion over utility installations. Once we establish non-compliance, we can mandate connection to the central system." "What about resistance from homeowners?" Patricia laughed, a sharp sound that made my skin crawl. "They'll comply or face daily fines. We've already established precedent with the Hendersons. They paid $8,000 to connect rather than fight it." I saved the video and sent it immediately to Rebecca with a note. "This was recorded an hour ago. Patricia, an unknown man discussing forcing homeowners to connect to centralized system." Rebecca called me within minutes. "Zachary, this is gold." She's essentially admitting to using HOA authority to coerce homeowners into paying for a system they don't need. And if her husband stands to profit from installing these systems in communities, that's a massive conflict of interest. I'm going to push for an emergency hearing. The next day, Rebecca filed motions with the Maricopa County Superior Court, an emergency temporary restraining order to prevent the HOA from interfering with my utility access, and a request for a preliminary injunction. She also filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA operations. While we waited for the court date, I decided to do something risky. I called a locksmith and had the chain removed from my propane tank. I documented everything with photos and video, showing the lock, the removal process, and the lack of damage to any property. The locksmith gave me a written statement confirming that the lock had been added without authorization from the property owner. Patricia showed up at my house within hours. "You had no right to remove that lock," she practically screamed from my driveway. "That was placed there by HOA authority." I stood on my porch, phone recording the entire interaction. "Patricia, you had no right to place it there in the first place. This is my property, and that's my propane tank. You've been notified by my attorney that your actions constitute illegal interference with utility services. Your attorney," her face flushed red, "you're suing the HOA. I'm asking the court to prevent you from continuing to harass me and restrict my access to essential services. There's a hearing scheduled for next week. This is ridiculous. I'm enforcing the covenants that you agreed to when you bought your home. Show me where in the CC and Articus it says you can lock up my propane tank." She sputtered for a moment. "Section 17, subsection C clearly states that all utility installations must be approved. My tank was installed over 10 years ago by the previous owner. I've requested historical records from the title company, and I've been informed that the installation was properly permitted with the county. The HOA approved it at the time. What you're really trying to do is force me to connect to a centralized system that benefits your husband's development company." Her expression went from angry to shocked to calculating in about 3 seconds. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Really. Because I have video of you and a contractor discussing how to force homeowners into compliance so they'll pay connection fees. I also have records showing that your husband's company specializes in integrated utility systems for planned communities. That seems like something you should have disclosed to the HOA board and membership." Patricia took a step back. "That's completely separate from HOA business, is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're using your position as HOA president to create business opportunities for your husband's company. That's called a conflict of interest, Patricia. In some cases, it's called fraud." She turned and walked back to her Lexus, but before she got in, she called back. "You're going to regret this, Zachary. I'll make sure of it." The hearing took place the following Wednesday at the Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix. Rebecca had prepared a comprehensive brief outlining Patricia's actions, the potential conflict of interest, and the threat to essential services. Patricia showed up with the HOA's attorney, a stern-looking man named Gerald Simmons. Judge Martin Chen, no relation to my neighbor Marcus, reviewed the filings and listened to both sides. Rebecca presented the video evidence, the violation notices, photos of the locked propane tank, and documentation of the HOA's attempts to force a centralized system without proper approval. Gerald Simmons argued that the HOA had broad authority under the CC and Articus to enforce architectural and safety standards, and that Patricia had acted within her discretion as president. Judge Chen was not impressed. "Mr. Simmons, I've reviewed the Desert Springs CC and Articus, and while they do grant the HOA authority over utility installations, nothing in these documents gives the association the right to restrict access to existing, functional utility services. Furthermore, the evidence suggests that Ms. Westfield may have a financial interest in forcing homeowners to adopt a centralized system. That raises serious questions about her fitness to serve as HOA president." "Your Honor," Simmons protested, "the HOA is simply trying to improve community standards and reduce long-term costs. By locking up a homeowner's propane tank, by threatening forced removal of essential equipment. That's not community improvement, Mr. Simmons. That's harassment. The judge granted the temporary restraining order, prohibiting the HOA from interfering with my utility access in any way. He also ordered the HOA to provide a full accounting of any financial relationships between board members and companies that would benefit from the proposed centralized system. As we left the courthouse, Patricia shot me a look of pure hatred, but I felt vindicated. Finally, someone with authority had recognized how unreasonable her actions were. The next few days were quiet, suspiciously so. No violation notices, no visits from Patricia, no threatening letters. I should have known it wouldn't last. On Saturday morning, I went out to check my propane level, which I did weekly. The gauge showed 60%, which seemed low. I just had it filled to 95% 2 weeks ago, and I hadn't been using heat much given the mild Arizona weather. I called Desert Gas Solutions and asked Rita if she could check my usage history. "That's odd," she said after pulling up my account. "Your usage rate has tripled in the past 2 weeks. According to our system, you should be using about 40 to 50 gallons per month. But you've used nearly 150 gallons since your last fill. That doesn't make sense. I've barely been home. I've been using the heater maybe an hour or two in the mornings. Let me schedule a technician to come check for leaks." If you're losing that much propane, you could have a serious safety issue. The technician, a guy named Miguel, arrived that afternoon. He spent an hour checking all my appliances, the lines, the connections, everything. No leaks. "Your system is tight," he said, showing me the readings on his detector. "No leaks anywhere, but someone's definitely using your propane. How is that possible? Do any of your neighbors have access to your tank?" I thought about the layout of the neighborhood. My tank was on the side of my property, visible from the street but not from any neighbor's yard. Not that I know of. Why? Because someone could be tapping into your line. It's not common, but it happens. People steal propane sometimes, especially in rural areas. They'll splice into a line at night, fill their own tanks, and disconnect before anyone notices. But we're in a suburban neighborhood in Scottsdale. That seems unlikely. Miguel shrugged. "I'm just telling you what the numbers say. You're losing propane somewhere, and it's not from leaks or normal usage." After he left, I set up my new security camera to monitor the propane tank area. I'd invested in a good system after the lock incident, and now I was glad I had. That night, I sat in my living room watching a basketball game, but I kept my laptop open with the security camera feed running. Around 11:30 p.m., movement caught my attention. A figure approached my propane tank, moving carefully and staying in the shadows. They wore dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low. I watched as they pulled out what looked like a hose and connected it to my tank, then ran the hose to something just out of frame. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "There's someone stealing propane from my property right now," I told the dispatcher. "I have them on camera." "Stay inside and don't confront them," she instructed. "Officers are on the way." I kept watching the feed. The figure worked quickly, clearly familiar with the process. After about 10 minutes, they disconnected the hose and started to leave. That's when the police arrived, lights off, blocking the driveway. 2 officers approached the figure, who froze. As they turned them around and into the light, I saw the face clearly. It was Patricia's husband, Richard Westfield. I threw on shoes and headed outside where Officer Rodriguez, who'd responded to my first call about the locked tank, was putting Richard in handcuffs. "Mr. Everson," Rodriguez said, "is this your property?" "Yes, and that's my propane tank he was stealing from." Richard glared at me. "I wasn't stealing anything. I was inspecting the installation for safety compliance. With a hose, Rodriguez held up the equipment Richard had dropped. This is a propane transfer line. You were siphoning fuel. I have authorization from the HOA. The HOA doesn't own this propane tank, sir. Mr. Everson does. And we have a court order stating that the HOA is prohibited from interfering with his utility access. You're under arrest for theft. As they led Richard to the patrol car, a second vehicle pulled up. Patricia jumped out, still in a nightgown with a coat thrown over it. What's going on? Richard, Officer Rodriguez explained the situation. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, anger, calculation. This is a misunderstanding, she said quickly. We were just trying to verify the tank's capacity for HOA records. It's part of our due diligence. Madam, your husband was transferring propane from this tank to another container. That's theft. And given the court order regarding this property, you both could be facing additional charges for violating a judicial order. A third officer emerged from the side of my house, rolling a large portable propane cylinder. Found this, Rodriguez. It's about half full. They'd been stealing my propane and storing it in portable tanks. But why? The answer came the next day when Rebecca called me with news from her investigation. I found something interesting, she said. Richard's company has been contracted to install the centralized propane system in Desert Springs, assuming it gets approved. The contract is worth approximately $2.3 million. But here's the kicker. Patricia has a 50% ownership stake in one of the subsidiary companies involved in the project, so she stands to personally profit from forcing homeowners to connect to the system. Exactly, and it gets better. I pulled records from the HOA's treasury, and there have been several unexplained transfers over the past 6 months, totaling about $35,000, to a consulting company owned by, you guessed it, Richard Westfield. She's been embezzling HOA funds to pay her husband's company. That's what it looks like. I've forwarded everything to the Arizona Attorney General's office. They're opening an investigation. The arrest of Richard Westfield made the local news. The story was too juicy to ignore. HOA president's husband caught stealing propane from homeowners' property. By Monday morning, the story had spread through Desert Springs like wildfire. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Patricia didn't show up. Instead, her attorney, Gerald Simmons, appeared and announced her resignation as president, effective immediately. Miss Westfield recognizes that recent events have created an untenable situation. He read from a prepared statement. She maintains that she acted in what she believed to be the best interests of the community, but acknowledges that the appearance of impropriety makes it impossible for her to continue serving effectively. The members present weren't buying it. Marcus stood up and voiced what everyone was thinking. Patricia used her position to benefit her husband's business and steal from homeowners. That's not an appearance of impropriety, that's actual fraud. We want a complete audit of HOA finances and a vote on dissolving the current board. Susan Kowalski, the treasurer, nodded. I support that. I've been trying to get clear answers about several questionable expenses for months, and Patricia kept blocking my requests. If there's been misappropriation of funds, we need to know the extent. Over the next few weeks, the situation unraveled completely. The audit revealed that Patricia had approved payments totaling over $60,000 to companies owned by her husband, all disguised as legitimate HOA expenses. Landscaping consultations, architectural reviews, engineering assessments. None of the work had actually been performed. The propane theft was even more extensive than I'd realized. Security camera footage from other homes, once people started checking, showed Richard Westfield had been stealing propane from multiple properties over the course of 3 months. In total, he'd taken approximately 800 gallons, worth about $2,000. Desert Gas Solutions filed a formal complaint with law enforcement, as did several other homeowners. The utility company had been trying to figure out the discrepancies in their delivery records for weeks, and now it all made sense. The Arizona Attorney General's office got involved, filing charges against both Patricia and Richard. Patricia was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. Richard faced multiple counts of theft, trespassing, and violation of a court order. At their arraignment in May, both pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. My security footage showing Richard in the act became a key piece of evidence. The audit trail of HOA funds flowing to Richard's companies was clear and documented. The propane company's records showed usage patterns that perfectly matched Richard's theft activities. The court proceedings took months, but by September, both Patricia and Richard agreed to plea deals. Patricia pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud, receiving a sentence of 3 years in prison with 2 years suspended, plus restitution to the HOA and affected homeowners. Richard pleaded guilty to theft and received 2 years in prison, also with restitution requirements. The total amount they had to pay back exceeded $90,000, plus legal fees and fines. Back in Desert Springs, the HOA underwent a complete transformation. The entire board was replaced through a special election. Marcus Chen became the new president, with a mandate to restore trust and transparency. One of the first actions of the new board was to officially approve all existing propane installations, including mine, with a grandfather clause that protected homeowners from retroactive compliance requirements. The proposed centralized propane system was abandoned entirely. Susan Kowalski, who stayed on as treasurer, implemented new financial controls requiring board approval for any expense over $500 and mandatory quarterly audits by an independent accounting firm. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my house in peace. My propane tank, properly approved and documented, sat on its concrete pad without chains, locks, or interference. Desert Gas Solutions continued to provide reliable service at competitive rates. I invested in a comprehensive security system, not just for the propane tank but for my entire property. Better safe than sorry, especially after everything that had happened. The story became something of a legend in Desert Springs and the surrounding communities. Other HOAs in the area took notice and started examining their own governance practices. Several boards implemented conflict of interest policies and financial transparency measures to prevent similar situations. In November, I attended the HOA annual meeting, where Marcus gave a state of the community address. "This year has been challenging," he said, "but it's taught us important lessons about accountability and the proper role of an HOA. We're here to maintain our common areas and preserve property values, not to control every aspect of homeowners' lives or create revenue streams for board members. Going forward, we'll be operating with transparency, respect for property rights, and adherence to both our covenants and the law." The room applauded. It felt like a new beginning. Later that month, I ran into Rita from Desert Gas Solutions at a coffee shop in Scottsdale. She recognized me immediately. "Mr. Everson, how's everything going with your propane service?" "Perfect, thanks to you. That call about suspicious usage history saved me a lot of trouble. We kept seeing these weird patterns across multiple accounts in your neighborhood. It never occurred to us that someone was actually stealing propane. I mean, who does that? Someone desperate to make a business deal work, apparently. She shook her head. The whole thing was crazy, but hey, at least you got a good story out of it. That was true. Whenever someone asked me about HOA horror stories, I had one that topped them all. In December, I received a check for $1,800 as part of the restitution settlement. It covered the stolen propane, legal fees, and damages. Patricia and Richard's assets had been liquidated to pay back their victims, including the sale of their home in Desert Springs. The house sold quickly to a young couple with 2 kids. I met them when they moved in and gave them a brief, sanitized version of the neighborhood's recent history. "So basically, don't abuse your power as an HOA board member," the husband Dave joked. "That's the gist of it," I agreed. His wife Linda looked concerned. "Is the HOA really strict here?" "Not anymore. Actually, it's pretty reasonable now. Just follow the basic rules about maintaining your property and you'll be fine. And if you ever have any issues, the new board is very approachable." They seemed relieved. As Christmas approached, Desert Springs looked peaceful and normal. Lights went up on houses without anyone measuring their lumens or citing covenant violations. The neighborhood felt more like an actual community than a collection of properties under bureaucratic control. On Christmas Eve, Marcus hosted a neighborhood party at his house. About 50 people showed up, including the new board members and many of the homeowners who'd been affected by Patricia's schemes. "I want to propose a toast," Marcus said, raising his glass. "To Zachary, who had the courage to stand up to corruption and fight for what was right. If you hadn't pushed back, who knows how long Patricia's scheme would have continued." People raised their glasses and cheered. I felt a little embarrassed by the attention, but also proud. Standing up to Patricia had been scary and expensive, but it had been the right thing to do. "I just wanted to use my propane tank in peace," I said, getting a laugh from the crowd. But seriously, this whole situation taught me that HOAs work best when everyone participates and holds leadership accountable. We can't just assume the board has our best interests at heart. We have to stay involved. The party continued late into the night, with neighbors sharing stories and making plans for the new year. Someone suggested organizing a community watch program. Not the paranoid kind that Patricia would have loved, but a genuine neighborly looking out for each other arrangement. In January, I got a letter from the court system notifying me that Patricia and Richard had begun serving their sentences. Patricia was at the Perryville Women's Prison in Goodyear, while Richard was incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. I didn't feel celebratory about it. Prison was a harsh consequence, even for people who'd done what they did. But I also believed in accountability. They'd abused positions of trust, stolen from their neighbors, and broken multiple laws in pursuit of profit. The consequences were appropriate. The new HOA board scheduled quarterly town halls where homeowners could voice concerns and ask questions. The first one, in February, drew a large crowd. People wanted to be heard after years of Patricia's authoritarian leadership. One resident, an elderly woman named Margaret, stood up and shared her experience. "Patricia fined me $300 last year because my desert landscaping wasn't aesthetic enough for her standards. She wanted me to install grass, even though that's wasteful in Arizona. The new board reviewed my case and refunded the fine. That's the kind of leadership we need." Others shared similar stories of unreasonable fines, arbitrary enforcement, and petty harassment. It became clear that Patricia's behavior toward me wasn't unique. She'd been bullying homeowners for years, and most had simply paid the fines or complied with her demands rather than fight back. "That ends now," Marcus said firmly. "This board works for you, not the other way around. If you get a violation notice that seems unreasonable, You have the right to appeal it. We'll listen and make fair decisions based on the actual covenants, not personal preferences. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. Desert Springs started feeling like a neighborhood where people wanted to live, not a prison camp with palm trees. In March, Rebecca Klein called me with final news about the legal proceedings. The court has closed the restitution case. Patricia and Richard have transferred all remaining assets to cover their debts. You and the other affected homeowners should receive your full settlement amounts within 60 days. What about the HOA's losses? The insurance company is covering most of that. Desert Springs had directors and officers' liability coverage, thank goodness. It doesn't cover criminal acts, but it does cover the cost of dealing with them, legal fees, audits, all of that. Good. The last thing we need is a special assessment to cover Patricia's theft. Exactly. Oh, and one more thing. The Attorney General's office is using this case as an example in updated HOA oversight guidelines. They're implementing new requirements for financial transparency and conflict of interest disclosures. Your situation is literally changing how HOAs operate in Arizona. That was gratifying to hear. If something good could come from this mess, making it harder for future HOA tyrants to abuse their power was a worthy outcome. By spring, life in Desert Springs had settled into a comfortable routine. My propane tank sat unmolested, my bills were reasonable, and nobody was demanding access to my utilities. It was everything I'd wanted when I moved there. I'd learned valuable lessons from the experience. Never assume that HOA leadership has your best interests at heart. Document everything. Don't be afraid to push back against unreasonable demands. And when something doesn't make sense, ask questions until you understand the real motivation. Patricia's push for centralized propane hadn't been about community improvement or cost savings. It had been about creating a revenue stream she could control and manipulate, funneling money to her husband's company while taking a cut for herself. The propane theft had been a test run, a way to gather market data and prove the feasibility of the system. If I'd simply complied with her demands, paid the connection fees, and accepted the centralized system, she would have gotten away with it. Other homeowners would have followed, and within a year, the entire neighborhood would have been locked into an overpriced utility scheme that enriched the Westfields while providing no actual benefit to residents. One afternoon in April, I was working in my front yard when a car pulled up. A woman in her 30s got out, introducing herself as Jennifer Morrison, a reporter for the Arizona Republic. I'm doing a story about HOA abuses and reform efforts. Your case keeps coming up as a turning point. Would you be willing to talk about your experience? I hesitated. The whole ordeal was behind me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to rehash it for public consumption. But then I thought about other homeowners dealing with similar situations, feeling powerless against their HOAs. Sure, I said. Let's talk. The interview lasted about an hour. Jennifer was thorough, asking about everything from the initial violation notice to the discovery of the propane theft to the court proceedings. She also interviewed Marcus, Rebecca Klein, and several other Desert Springs residents. The article ran in May with the headline, "How One Homeowner Exposed an HOA Fraud Scheme." It detailed Patricia's abuse of power, the financial irregularities, and the reforms that had followed. The story went viral, shared across social media, and picked up by national news outlets. My phone rang constantly for a few days. Other homeowners from around the country called or emailed, sharing their own HOA horror stories and asking for advice. Some were dealing with similar situations. Board members with conflicts of interest, questionable financial practices, arbitrary enforcement of rules. I couldn't help everyone, but I connected people with Rebecca Klein and other attorneys who specialized in HOA law. I shared resources about homeowner rights and strategies for holding boards accountable. The experience transformed me from a guy who just wanted to be left alone into an accidental advocate for HOA reform. It wasn't a role I'd sought, but it felt meaningful. In June, the Arizona legislature passed new HOA oversight laws, directly inspired by cases like mine. The reforms required detailed financial disclosures, mandatory conflict of interest statements from board members, and clearer procedures for homeowners to challenge board decisions. Governor Katie Hobbs invited several people, including me, to attend the bill's signing ceremony in Phoenix. Standing in the governor's office, surrounded by legislators and advocates who'd pushed for these reforms, I felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond my personal victory. These protections will help thousands of Arizona homeowners, Governor Hobbs said as she signed the bill. HOAs serve important functions, but they must operate transparently and respect property rights. No one should have to fight as hard as some of our citizens have fought just to use their own utilities or enjoy their own homes. After the ceremony, I talked with other homeowners who'd experienced HOA abuses. Their stories ranged from the petty to the outrageous. Fines for having the wrong color mailbox, foreclosure threats over minor violations, boards that operated like personal fiefdoms with no accountability. One man, Carlos from Temp, told me his HOA had tried to force him to remove solar panels from his roof, claiming they were unsightly. He'd had to hire an attorney and cite state laws protecting solar installations. The whole process had taken 8 months and cost him thousands of dollars. The crazy thing is, I'm an engineer, Carlos said. I know how to research laws and fight back, but what about people who don't have that knowledge or can't afford lawyers? They just get steamrolled. That was the real problem. HOAs operated with significant power over people's homes and lives, but often without adequate oversight or accountability. People like Patricia could exploit that system for personal gain, knowing that most homeowners wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. By summer, Desert Springs had become a model for successful HOA reform. Marcus and the new board had implemented best practices that other communities started adopting: regular town halls, transparent budgeting, reasonable enforcement of rules, and respect for homeowner autonomy. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased after Patricia's departure. Turns out people were willing to pay more to live in a community with fair, reasonable leadership, rather than one run by a dictator. My propane tank became something of a symbol. Neighbors joked about it being the tank that launched 1,000 reforms. Someone even suggested putting up a historical marker, though I declined that honor. In August, I received a letter from Patricia's attorney. She wanted to apologize and request that I write a letter to the parole board supporting early release. I thought about it for several days. On one hand, Patricia had terrorized me and other homeowners, stolen from the community, and shown no remorse until she got caught. On the other hand, holding on to anger wasn't helping anyone. I wrote back declining to support early release, but stating that I bore her no personal ill will and hoped she would use her time in prison to reflect on her actions and make better choices in the future. It felt like the right balance, accountability without vindictiveness. As autumn arrived, marking a full year since Patricia's initial violation notice, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. What had started as a simple dispute about a propane tank had evolved into a fight against corruption, a legal battle, criminal prosecutions, and ultimately, meaningful reform. I'd learned that standing up for what's right isn't always easy or convenient. It had cost me time, money, stress, and sleep. But it had also brought unexpected rewards, a stronger sense of community, meaningful relationships with my neighbors, and the knowledge that I'd made a difference. The new Desert Springs was everything the old one should have been. A well-maintained community with reasonable rules, transparent leadership, and respect for individual homeowners. The common areas looked great, violations were handled fairly, and nobody lived in fear of arbitrary fines or harassment. In October, the HOA held its annual meeting. I'd been nominated for a board position, but declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. Instead, I volunteered to serve on the Architectural Review Committee, helping evaluate requests for home modifications. It was satisfying work, applying common sense instead of arbitrary preferences. When someone wanted to install solar panels, we approved it as long as it met building codes. When someone wanted to paint their house a new color, we looked at whether it fit the desert aesthetic, not whether it matched Patricia's personal taste. The November election brought new board members who'd run on platforms of continued transparency and homeowner advocacy. The days of unopposed elections and entrenched leadership were over. Desert Springs had become a functioning democracy, not a dictatorship. As Christmas approached again, I decorated my house without worrying about whether my lights were the approved color or my wreath was the proper size. It was liberating to simply enjoy my home without constant scrutiny. On Christmas Eve, the neighborhood gathered at the community center for a holiday party. The turnout was even bigger than the previous year, with nearly 100 residents attending. Marcus gave a short speech about the journey the community had taken. A year ago, we were dealing with the aftermath of a scandal that could have torn this neighborhood apart. Instead, we came together, demanded better, and built something stronger. I'm proud to be part of this community, not because our houses look perfect, but because our people are engaged, informed, and committed to doing what's right. The crowd applauded, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heaters running in the community center. This was what a neighborhood should be. People who looked out for each other, held leadership accountable, and worked together toward common goals. As the new year began, I realized that the propane tank saga had fundamentally changed my perspective. I'd moved to Desert Springs seeking peace and quiet, wanting to avoid drama and conflict. Instead, I'd found myself in the middle of a battle against corruption and abuse of power. But by fighting that battle, I'd gained something more valuable than peace and quiet: purpose, community, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd stood up for what was right. My propane tank continued to function perfectly, supplying fuel for heating, cooking, and hot water. It was just a metal cylinder filled with liquefied gas, but it had become a symbol of something larger: the right of homeowners to live free from harassment, the importance of accountability in positions of authority, and the power of one person standing up to make a difference. Patricia and Richard remained in prison, serving their sentences and, hopefully, reflecting on the choices that had brought them there. The HOA they tried to exploit for personal gain had been transformed into a model of good governance. Desert Springs thrived under new leadership, and I enjoyed my home in peace, secure in the knowledge that my utilities were my own, my property rights were protected, and my HOA actually served the community rather than exploiting it. The propane tank sat on its concrete pad, painted beige to match the desert landscape, functioning exactly as it should. No chains, no locks, no drama. Just fuel for my home, and a reminder of an extraordinary chapter in my life that had taught me the value of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Sometimes I'd look at it while having my morning coffee and smile, remembering the absurdity of someone trying to lock up my fuel supply, the shock of discovering organized theft, and the satisfaction of seeing justice served. It was, in the end, just a propane tank. But it was my propane tank, on my property, serving my needs, protected by the law and common sense. And that, after everything that had happened, felt exactly right.